When empires fall, history usually makes noise. There is the thunder of cannons, the crack of rifle fire, the roar of armies clashing at dawn. We are taught to expect violence. But the most devastating collapses in human history didn't come with explosions. They came with paperwork. They came with ledgers, with signatures, with interest schedules written in elegant European handwriting. And sometimes an empire doesn't fall on the battlefield at all. Sometimes it is foreclosed. This is the story of how the Ottoman Empire, one of the longest-lasting and most powerful empires the world has ever known, was dismantled not by invading armies but by debt, not by gunpowder but by compound interest, not by generals but by bankers sitting in London and Paris. This is the story of the first modern debt-trap empire, and it explains a geopolitical truth that still shapes the modern world. You do not need to conquer a nation to control it. You only need to own its balance sheet. In the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire still looked enormous. On the map, it stretched across 3 continents, from the Balkans deep into Eastern Europe, across Anatolia into the heart of the Middle East, down through North Africa toward the gates of the Sahara. It ruled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. It controlled the Bosphorus, the choke point between Europe and Asia. It sat astride the most important trade crossroads on earth. From Istanbul, the Sultan ruled over tens of millions of subjects. To foreign diplomats, it still looked like a great power, but appearances can lie. Because beneath the surface of imperial ceremony, the Ottoman Empire was decaying, not militarily, economically. While Britain, France, and Germany were transforming themselves through the Industrial Revolution, the Ottoman economy remained trapped in an earlier age. Europe was building factories powered by steam. The Ottomans were still relying on agriculture. Europe was mass-producing steel, textiles, and weapons. The Ottomans were exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. This imbalance was lethal, because in the modern world, power no longer came from land alone. It came from productivity, from industry, from capital accumulation. And the Ottoman Empire had none of these in sufficient quantity. The Ottoman state had a permanent problem. It never had enough money. The tax system was archaic and inefficient. Local governors skimmed revenue before it reached Istanbul. Tax farmers exploited peasants but delivered little to the treasury. Corruption was systemic, not accidental. For centuries, Ottoman rulers survived financial crises using medieval tools, debasing coinage, seizing property, purging officials. But the global economy had changed. European merchants demanded gold. Foreign creditors demanded interest. Markets punished uncertainty. The old tricks stopped working. To the north, the Russian Empire loomed. Russia wanted access to warm water ports, dominance over the Balkans, control of the Black Sea. Conflict with Russia wasn't optional. It was inevitable, and modern warfare was ruinously expensive. Cannons, steel warships, standing armies, railways, all of it required cash. The Ottoman Empire had land. It had manpower, but it didn't have money. For generations, Ottoman rulers resisted borrowing from Europe. There were religious objections to interest, cultural distrust of Christian bankers, political fear of dependence, but desperation dissolves principles. In 1853, Russia invaded Ottoman territory, triggering the Crimean War. Britain and France intervened, not to save the Ottomans but to stop Russia. They sent armies. They sent fleets, and quietly they sent bankers. The war drained the Ottoman treasury at a terrifying rate. Soldiers needed pay, weapons needed manufacture, ships needed coal. Sultan Abdul I faced an impossible choice. To survive, the empire had to borrow. In 1854, the Ottoman Empire signed its first foreign loan agreement with British and French banks. It was framed as an act of alliance. In reality, it was an act of surrender. The terms were brutal. The bonds were issued at 80% of face value. For every £100 of debt the empire accepted, it received only £80 in cash. but interest was charged on the full amount. The bankers took their profit immediately. This was the original sin of Ottoman finance. The empire entered the global credit system already wounded. But when the gold arrived in Istanbul, it felt like salvation. Soldiers were paid, the crisis receded, the war continued, and something dangerous happened. The empire discovered easy money. The Crimean War ended in 1856. The borrowing did not. Ottoman elites had tasted foreign capital. With a signature in London or Paris, gold appeared. No reforms required. No structural change. No painful modernization. Just debt. They looked at Europe with envy. Gaslit streets, opera houses, monuments of stone and steel. They didn't want economic reform. They wanted appearance. Chapter 8, The Palace That Sealed Their Fate. Nothing symbolized this obsession more than Dolmabahce Palace. Sultan Abdulaziz despised the old Topkapi Palace, too traditional, too Ottoman, too Eastern. He wanted a palace that screamed modernity, so he built Dolmabahce on the shores of the Bosphorus. It was obscene in its luxury. 14 tons of gold leaf, the largest crystal chandelier in the world, marble imported from Italy, silk carpets, baccarat crystal staircases. The palace cost 5 million gold lira, a quarter of the empire's annual revenue, and it was paid for entirely with borrowed money. While peasants starved in Anatolia, the Sultan imported crystal. Dolmabahce wasn't just a palace, it was a financial death marker. Loans followed loans. 1855, 1856, 1857, 1858, 1859. Each one larger, each one more expensive. By the 1860s, the empire could no longer pay interest from tax revenue, so it borrowed to pay interest, a Ponzi scheme disguised as governance. By 1870, over 50% of all government income went to debt service. Every fisherman, every farmer, every merchant. Half their labor was exported instantly to European bondholders. The empire was being hollowed out from the inside. When European loans stalled, the government turned to local financiers, the Galata bankers, Greek and Armenian families operating out of Istanbul. They charged 18% interest, 20% interest, sometimes more, short-term loans at predatory rates, but the treasury had no choice. This was survival borrowing. Sultan Abdulaziz wasn't satisfied with palaces. He wanted a navy, ironclads, modern warships, imperial prestige. He ordered them from British shipyards. For a moment, the Ottoman navy became the third largest in the world on paper. In reality, there was no money for coal. The ships rusted in harbor, floating monuments to debt. In 1873, disaster struck. A global financial panic began in Vienna. European capital markets froze. At the same time, drought devastated Anatolia. Crops failed. Livestock died. Tax revenue collapsed. Debt payments did not. By 1875, the treasury was empty. No loans, no reserves, no options. The empire faced a brutal choice: starve its people or default. On October 6, 1875, the Ottoman government issued the Decree of Ramadan. Debt payments were cut in half, the rest replaced with promises. In financial terms, the Ottoman Empire went bankrupt. When the Ottoman government announced the Decree of Ramadan in October 1875, cutting debt payments and replacing the rest with paper promises, Europe heard one word: default. In polite diplomatic language, it was described as a temporary moratorium, a restructuring, a necessary adjustment. But in the real language of markets, it was a financial earthquake. Because Ottoman bonds weren't held only by rich aristocrats or giant banking houses. They were held by ordinary people, middle-class clerks in London, shopkeepers in Paris, retired officers, widows with savings. Ottoman bonds offered high yields. They were marketed as exotic but profitable. A little risky, yes, but with the comforting belief that the Ottoman Empire was too important to fail. Investors assumed Britain and France would always protect it from collapse, because it sat on the strategic crossroads of Europe and Asia. That assumption, that someone else will step in to prevent disaster, is a powerful financial drug. It has a name: moral hazard. Banks took risks because they believed their governments would never allow the Ottoman Empire to fall apart. And the Ottoman elite took loans because they believed the same thing. Someone would rescue them if the debt became too heavy. But now, for the first time, Europeans felt what Ottoman peasants had felt for decades: the pain of the empire's finances. Newspapers exploded with outrage. The Turks were labeled thieves, swindlers, uncivilized, untrustworthy. And something subtle but crucial happened inside European capitals. Support for the Ottoman Empire evaporated, not because its strategic value disappeared, but because investors lost money. In geopolitics, that's often what morality means. A default doesn't just harm a state's reputation, it broadcasts weakness. It tells the world, this government is struggling. This government is distracted. This government can't mobilize resources. And in the 19th century, when empires watched each other like predators, weakness was an invitation. Russia saw it immediately. For decades, Russia had wanted to push south, to break Ottoman control of the Balkans, to gain influence over Orthodox Christian populations, to dominate the Black Sea, to place Istanbul under pressure. The Crimean War had stopped Russia once, but it hadn't changed Russian ambition. Now the Ottoman Empire looked broke, isolated, and diplomatically exposed. So Russia moved. In 1877, Russia declared war. The Russo-Turkish War was brutal, and the Ottoman army fought hard, but it was fighting with a broken financial engine behind it. Wars require logistics, supply chains, and steady cash flow. Soldiers have to be paid. Weapons have to be repaired. Food has to be moved. Ammunition has to be purchased. But the Ottoman state had already been hollowed out by debt payments. Half of the empire's income was already committed to foreign bondholders. So the army was underfunded. Many soldiers were unpaid or paid late. Supplies were inconsistent. Morale was fragile. Equipment was outdated in critical areas. And while the Ottoman state staggered under financial pressure, Russia marched with momentum. The Russian army pushed deep into Ottoman territory. The war ended in catastrophe. Russian forces reached the outskirts of Istanbul. They could see the minarets. They were close enough that the city felt the threat in its bones. This was not just military humiliation. It was financial humiliation made visible. The Ottoman Empire was forced to sign a humiliating peace agreement. Territories in the Balkans and the Caucasus were lost. The empire shrank. But what truly destroyed the Ottoman future wasn't only land loss. It was the clause written in numbers. Russia imposed an enormous war indemnity, over 800 million francs, a punishment bill. Now the Ottoman Empire had a layered crisis. 1. It owed vast sums to British and French bondholders and had defaulted. 2. It now owed a crushing war debt to Russia. 3. It had lost territory, which meant it lost tax revenue. 4. Its credit was destroyed, which meant it couldn't borrow cheaply. This is the nightmare formula of collapse: more debt plus less revenue plus no credit plus higher risk. At this point, the empire wasn't just struggling. It was insolvent. The Sultan could still sit on a throne, but he was the ruler of a budget that didn't work. During this era of chaos, Abdul Hamid II ascended the throne. He inherited a nightmare: an empire weakened militarily, humiliated diplomatically, and bleeding financially. And Abdul Hamid understood something terrifying. The European powers didn't need to conquer Istanbul with armies. They could conquer it with ledgers. Because once a government loses solvency, it becomes negotiable. Not as a nation, as a revenue stream. Here's what's important. Britain and France could have invaded and partitioned the Ottoman Empire right there. But conquest is expensive. Occupation requires soldiers, administration, and constant resistance management. Europe had learned that taking land creates responsibility, but taking revenue creates profit. So the European bondholders and their governments developed a smarter plan. They decided to extract Ottoman wealth without directly ruling Ottoman people. They would do what modern finance does best: turn a nation into a payment machine. In 1881, representatives of the European bondholders arrived in Istanbul. Not generals, bankers, not with swords, with contracts. They negotiated what looked like a debt settlement, but functioned like a surrender. This resulted in the Decree of Muharrem, a document that transformed Ottoman sovereignty. It established one of the most important financial institutions in modern imperial history, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, the OPDA. This was the mechanism of soft conquest. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration was not Ottoman. It was foreign. It was essentially a corporation run by a board representing British interests, French interests, German interests, Italian and Austrian interests. It was headquartered in Istanbul, but it answered to Europe. And it didn't advise the Ottoman government. It controlled it. It functioned as a state within a state, a parallel government built purely to extract revenue. It was conquest by accounting. The Decree of Muharrem handed over the empire's most reliable revenue streams directly to foreign control. Not hypothetically, legally. The OPDA took over. The salt tax, the tobacco monopoly / taxes on spirits and alcohol, taxes on silk, taxes on fishing, stamp duties on legal documents, various customs-linked and excise revenues. These weren't small income sources. They were the arteries of the state. So imagine this. A fisherman catches fish in the Bosphorus, and a portion of his profit goes to a bondholder in London. A farmer harvests silk cocoons in Bursa, and the tax goes to Paris. A peasant buys salt for soup, and part of that coin ends up in Berlin. It wasn't metaphorical ownership. It was direct extraction. The OPDA built its own administration, its own collectors, its own enforcement, thousands of employees, uniforms, weapons, warehouses, accounting systems. And here's the brutal symbol: they answered not to the Sultan, but to the creditors. The Sultan became a landlord living in a house whose rent was collected by someone else. He still wore the crown, but the cash flow belonged to Europe. The Ottoman tax system had always been inefficient, fragmented, and corrupt. The OPDA was the opposite. It ran like a modern European company. It used systematic bookkeeping. It standardized collection. It cut leakages. It improved production in the sectors it controlled: salt, tobacco, silk. In some places, the OPDA even boosted economic output. But here's the catch: it boosted the economy for creditors, not for citizens, not for development. It was a growth engine built to funnel money outward. Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected roughly one-third of the entire revenue of the Ottoman Empire. Let that number sink in. 1 out of every 3 coins generated by Ottoman economic life was extracted and sent abroad. The Ottoman government was left with the scraps. And now consider the implications. The empire was expected to run a massive bureaucracy, maintain an army, manage rebellions, build schools, modernize infrastructure, defend borders, using only 2/3 of its own tax base. This is why the empire remained perpetually weak. Even when reforms were attempted, there was no capital, because the surplus was already pledged. The OPDA didn't just manage debt, it created structural underdevelopment. This wasn't only about money, it was about leverage. Once the OPDA existed, European powers could influence Ottoman decisions indirectly. If the Sultan resisted European policy, pressure could be applied through finance, through revenue control, through debt negotiations, through the threat of tightening credit. The empire became trapped not just economically, but diplomatically. And this is exactly how the next player entered the game. Because while Britain and France were content to squeeze the empire like a lemon, Germany saw something else: opportunity. By the late 19th century, Germany was rising. It was industrial, militarized, ambitious. and it wanted global influence. The Ottoman Empire, strategically located, weakened, hungry for infrastructure, was the perfect target. Germany didn't need to invade the Ottoman Empire. It could finance it, and financing can be more powerful than conquering. Which brings us to the moment the debt trap evolves into something even more dangerous, because now the empire won't just be owned by London and Paris. It will become a battleground of competing creditors. By the late 19th century, a new power was rising in Europe: Germany. Unified, industrialized, and ambitious, Germany arrived late to the imperial game. Britain and France already controlled vast colonial networks. Russia dominated Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Germany needed influence, and it needed it fast. The Ottoman Empire looked like the perfect opening. It sat at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. It controlled access to warm-water ports. It lay astride future oil regions. And most importantly, it was desperate. Germany did not arrive with ultimatums. It arrived with flattery. Kaiser Wilhelm II personally visited Istanbul. He praised the Sultan. He spoke of friendship. He framed Britain and France as parasites who only wanted to bleed the empire dry. Germany, he promised, wanted partnership, investment, modernization, respect. For a sultan humiliated by decades of financial control, this was intoxicating. Germany's offer came in the form of steel, railways. Specifically, the Berlin-Baghdad Railway. This was not just infrastructure, it was geopolitics in motion. A continuous rail line from Germany to the Persian Gulf would bypass the British-controlled Suez Canal, connect Europe directly to Middle Eastern resources, allow rapid troop movement, shift the balance of power in the region for the Ottoman Empire. The railway promised economic integration, faster military deployment, modern transportation, a symbol of sovereignty regained, but there was one problem. The Ottoman treasury was empty. Germany had a solution: loans. Deutsche Bank stepped in as the primary financier. But these loans were not charity. The railway contracts were loaded with conditions that quietly transferred control to German interests. The most devastating clause was the kilometric guarantee. This meant the Ottoman government guaranteed a fixed profit to German companies for every kilometer of track built, regardless of how many trains ran on it. If traffic was low, the Ottoman state paid the difference. And worse still, the contracts granted German companies exclusive rights to all minerals and oil found within 20 kilometers of the railway line. The Sultan had not escaped the debt trap. He had simply changed creditors, from British gold to German steel. By 1910, the Ottoman Empire was effectively a German economic satellite. German officers trained the army. German engineers ran the railways. German banks held the debt. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration still siphoned revenue to Britain and France. The empire was being pulled apart by competing creditors. Each power wanted influence. Each used debt as leverage. And the empire stood in the middle, too weak to resist, too valuable to abandon. This financial tug-of-war did not stay economic. It became political, then strategic, then existential. As Europe moved toward war, Ottoman debt became part of the fuse. Britain and France saw German influence in Istanbul as a direct threat. Germany saw the Ottomans as a strategic corridor to the Middle East. Russia feared losing access to warm waters. Debt had transformed the Ottoman Empire into a geopolitical prize. When World War I erupted in 1914, the Ottoman leadership faced a terrible choice: remain neutral and remain financially enslaved, or gamble everything. The Young Turk leadership believed Germany would win, and if Germany won, the debts to Britain and France could be cancelled. The Ottoman Public Debt Administration could be abolished. The empire could regain its sovereignty. So the Ottomans joined the war on Germany's side. One of their first acts, they marched into the OPDA headquarters. They expelled British and French officials. They stopped payments. For the first time in decades, the empire felt free. But freedom built on desperation is fragile. The gamble failed. World War I was catastrophic for the Ottomans. They fought on multiple fronts. The Caucasus, Gallipoli, Mesopotamia, Arabia the empire lacked. Industrial capacity, reliable logistics, financial reserves. Germany could not save them. The economy collapsed completely. Famine spread. Millions died. And when the war ended, the Ottoman Empire was finished. But the debt, it survived. After the war, the victorious powers dismantled the empire. Territories were carved up. Mandates were imposed. The Sultanate collapsed. But the creditors returned, ledgers in hand. They demanded payment. They argued that the successor states inherited the obligations of the empire. Debt, they said, does not disappear with flags. When the Turkish Republic was founded under Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in 1923, it rose from devastation. The country was poor, infrastructure shattered, population exhausted by war. And yet before schools, before factories, before prosperity, the new republic faced the old empire's debt. At the Treaty of Lausanne, European powers demanded repayment. Atatürk resisted, but he understood reality. Turkey needed access to global trade. It could not begin its life as a defaulter, so a compromise was reached. The debt was restructured, reduced, extended, but not erased. For decades, the young Turkish Republic sent money abroad. Money that could have built schools. Money that could have industrialized the economy. Money that could have lifted people from poverty. Instead, it paid for palaces built in the 1850s, warships that rusted in harbor, loans taken to pay interest on older loans. The final payment was made on May 25, 1954, exactly 100 years after the first Ottoman foreign loan. An entire century. That is the lifespan of a financial mistake. The Ottoman Empire did not fall because it lacked courage. It did not fall because its people were weak. It fell because it tried to purchase modernity instead of building it. It borrowed prosperity. It imported prestige. It confused appearance with power. And it underestimated the cost of dependency. The Ottoman story reveals a brutal truth. Debt is never neutral. Every loan carries power. Every bond carries leverage. When debt becomes structural, when it controls revenue, it replaces sovereignty. The British and French did not conquer Istanbul. They foreclosed on it. They proved that conquest in the modern world does not require armies. It requires interest schedules. Final monologue. The warning written in red ink: the sick man of Europe did not die of old age. He was foreclosed upon. The most efficient imperial conquest in history was not military. It was financial. And the lesson is eternal. Sovereignty is not just about flags or borders. It is about solvency. If you do not own your debt owns you. Thank you for watching. If you want to understand how economies rise and fall, how wealth is created and destroyed, and what history's greatest cautionary tales teach us about our own time, make sure to subscribe. These patterns repeat, and understanding them might be the most valuable knowledge you can possess. We'll see you in the next one.